The Guardian.
You're listening to a Guardian Live event. The Guardian has always been a community of readers, journalists and contributors. And now our live events are bringing these people together.
The Guardian events are The Guardian at its best, which is a two-way conversation involving the reader and having a real, genuine, thriving debate.
Could be anything from food and culture, arts, to politics, to foreign affairs. Guardian members can attend from the very serious to the quite frivolous.
Support The Guardian's independent journalism and experience it firsthand. To see what events are coming up and to check out the benefits of membership, go to members.theguardian.com.
Hello and welcome to the Guardian Live podcast, dedicated to all our live events. This Guardian Live event, Polly Toynbee versus Roger Scruton, was recorded at Islington Assembly Hall, London in November 2015. The evening was refereed by LBC's James O'Brien.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to this Guardian Live debate featuring the philosopher and polymath Roger Scruton, the journalist and author Polly Toynbee. We are here, at least in part, as you know, to mark the publication of Roger's book, Fools, Frauds and Firebrands, Thinkers of the New Left. It's a revision of sorts of a book published some time ago. And I thought we'd begin. Let me talk you through first how the evening's going to work. I'll invite both our guests in a moment to set out a stall of sorts, and then we'll examine a sort of variety of issues thrown up by current circumstances and by some of the themes that both of them have written about and discussed in the past. Approximately halfway through proceedings, I will invite you to contribute in any way you want. Well, I say in any way you want. I'll invite you to ask questions. If you're thinking of prefacing your contribution with a phrase such as, "This isn't really a question, it's more a succession of points," I'd very politely urge you to think long and hard before going down that avenue. We're short of time, and I predict there will be an awful lot of people seeking to put questions to Roger and indeed to Polly. But I'll kick off that process by posing the first question. I shall pose it first to Roger Scruton, and I would ask you why you wrote Fools, Frauds and Firebrands in the first place.
Well, I wrote it in the mid-1980s as a response, I suppose, to the way that I thought the universities had gone in the wake of 1968. That all kinds of people had become the authorities in philosophy and political science, whom I thought did not deserve their reputation, but were authorities because of their standing in the left-wing worldview. Some of them were great, like Sartre and Foucault, but others I thought were frauds. So I wrote a book about it, and called Thinkers of the New Left, and it was extremely damaging to me, not to anybody else. They survived my assault completely intact. I was not just rubbished, but made to feel as though I had committed the first order sin of an academic, which was criticising the real authorities of the day. And the book was remaindered. Everything looked terrible after a while.
Just give us an idea, because you're not exaggerating. I mean, you're laughing about it now, but at the time, this was a deeply wounding experience.
It was fairly wounding, yes. You could say I asked for it, but I was shocked at the extent of the hostility, and letters sent from my colleagues to the publisher telling them what mistake they'd made and all this sort of thing. So yes, I had to retire quietly from the public arena for a while to recuperate. But then 20 years later, people started pressing me to reissue it. By that time, it had been published quite widely in former communist countries, in what were communist countries in Samizdat, and then officially, and it started to get a kind of reputation as a statement that ought to be considered seriously, whether or not you agreed with it.
A statement of what?
A statement of what I put forward as the errors and intellectual fraudulence of much of the academic leftism that was prevalent in the wake of 1968, and also an attempt to say, first of all, what the left fundamentally is, and secondly, why it's fundamentally wrong.
Polly Toynbee, what the left fundamentally is, and I doubt you're going to explain why it's fundamentally wrong.
No, I don't think so. But I think I would say that the thinkers that you pick upon have been extraordinarily uninfluential. You behave as if they were some kind of establishment of immense power. But in the real world, where people really hold power, I don't think those kind of left-wing philosophers have had any influence whatever. If you think of the Labour governments that we've had, would you honestly say Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Tony Blair or Gordon Brown had driven their government by the precepts of those thinkers? I think not at all. On the other hand, if you look at the extraordinary power that certain right-wing thinkers have had in the real world, Mrs. Thatcher, I think not before Mrs. Thatcher, I think that the Conservatives in power, which they mostly were pretty unideological, but Mrs. Thatcher had a copy of Hayek's The Road to Serfdom in her handbag, and she used to, a battered copy. Sometimes she would almost hit people on the head with it. Hayek, Friedman, those people had a direct, powerful, and I think pernicious influence on the actual practice of her government and of the Conservative Party that has come after. And the government we have now, not very theoretical really, probably Cameron and Osborne not greatly interested in the way that Thatcher was in ideas of that kind. Nevertheless, they are brought up under it, totally imbuing all of its effects. They had pictures of Thatcher on their wall as students. They believe, with all their might and main, even if they just think it's a natural assumption of common sense rather than a theoretical system of thinking, that essentially the state is always wrong, the private sector will always do better, pushing the state back whenever you can will always be a good thing, and the private and the market will always be right. And that is the assumption that they work on, and the assumption that we saw worked out through the Thatcher years and now carried much further. We now have a more right-wing government than we've had in our lifetime since the war. And what we're about to see next week in the spending review will be the carrying out of this extraordinary programme to reduce the size of the state to 35% of GDP, permanently and forever, less than any other European country of the European 15, less even than America will be. By 2020, the aim is we will be at 35%, the Germans will be about 46%, French a bit more. We will be a different kind of country with a different notion of the state, and that is driven by right-wing thinkers in a way that left-wing thinkers have never driven governments.
Let me respond to that. The first point is that left-wing thinkers have driven governments. If you look at historians, including your ancestor, people like E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm and so on, these have been incredibly influential on the Labour Party, and I take them to task for that very reason. They inserted the egalitarian agenda deep into the Labour Party thinking, and also people like Raymond Williams, with their apologies for the Soviet experiment, influenced the foreign policy of people like Wilson. I think that exactly the same things could be said, but in my own defence, I would say that I was really talking about the cultural life, not the political life of our country, and trying to estimate and also stand up to the effect of these thinkers on the universities, on the humanities in particular, in displacing real thinking, and I think Hayek is an example of real thinking, Oakeshott likewise, and some of the left-wing thinkers too, displacing that thinking, however, from the centre of discussions and putting a kind of cut-price machine for generating anti-bourgeois arguments in the place of it. And if you think of the influence, just look at France, the influence that Sartre and Foucault have had, on the intellectual life of that nation, filtering down from the universities and, of course, the cafe intelligentsia down into the language of politics, then I think you might revise your opinion a bit. It doesn't necessarily the case that a particular politician is influenced by an intellectual, but if an intellectual changes the climate of opinion, then a politician, however stupid, will respond to that.
Well, I'm much more interested in the practical outcomes, really, of thinking, and I think looking at Labour governments, you could not say that any of them had been fellow travellers and dabblers in saying, somehow the Soviet Union was better than America or any of that stuff. The prime ministers I've listed to you with their governments, just not so. And the fact that there may have been people in universities who were fellow travellers or worse isn't really the point. What matters about thought in the end is what its practical outcomes are, what its influences are, how it influences the real world and real people. And I think we should come back to the question that you've brought up about equality, because you believe that any kind of egalitarianism is a mistaken goal. And that's about real practical things.
I'll come back to that momentarily. But before that, Roger, perhaps just a few more words on what unites your targets in thinkers of the New Left, because they are quite a disparate bunch, and to sort of group them in the same category, whether as leftists or as thinkers, what are the unifying themes?
What unites them, first of all, is my hostility.
I very nearly said apart from your hostility.
But they are united partly in their espousal of the leftist agenda, the egalitarian agenda, but also the theories that have gone with it. Many of them are Marxists or downstream from Marxism, and all of them were influential at the time that I was writing. That's the most important thing, influential on intellectual life. Now, I agree with Polly that, of course, politics is not the same thing as the intellectual life, and has its own standards, its own criteria, and they may not have been influential in politics in quite the way that I saw them in the intellectual world. But I happen to believe that the intellectual world matters because I'm part of it, and that's, of course, a vanity in one way, but everybody wants to believe that the thing that they are doing is important to the rest of the world. And I guess I'm guilty of that as much as Polly is. She thinks that because journalism is so important to her, it's important to the rest of us. And maybe it's not important at all.
Good Lord.
That's quite possible.
It's a bit early in the evening for existential angst. What then do you mean, Roger Scruton, by that relatively simple phrase, egalitarian agenda, in the way that plays back into the notion that it unites somehow everyone from Hobsbawm to Zizek?
I think that this is a really important question. We all of us think that human equality is a value of some kind. The question is, what kind of equality, and equality about what? I put this in question. I say, look, it's very easy to gain kudos by defending equality, but the onus is on you to define exactly what it means. Do you mean equality of possessions, or do you mean equality of opportunities? Do you mean equality of the freedoms to realize yourself? There are so many different things it could mean, and they're not obviously compatible. And always you find in all these thinkers, going even someone like Sartre, who's highly theoretical, in the end, the fallback position is that we're in favour of equality. Our opponents are in favour of privilege and power, and we're in the business of demolishing that. We're in the business of deconstructing the pretensions to power that our enemies are claiming. And that, I think, is the essence of the conflict between the left and right as it's been played out in the intellectual world.
Well, that plays into the political world as well, Polly Toynbee, the simple tension between whether you go the whole hog for sort of property as theft, or whether you simply support the notion of a little light redistribution of wealth. The right stands against it and the left stands for it.
I think you can absolutely say that's true. You've only got to look at the history of every single Labour versus Conservative government. The Conservative government always leaves the rich richer and the poor poorer. and this government is doing it as never before, all in it together, not. I think, Labour left many fewer poor pensioners, many fewer poor children, 1 million fewer poor children, through tax credits, through huge numbers of social programmes, and great investment in the idea of at least stopping inequality getting worse. They did very well. But I, not being a philosopher, don't have to produce for you the idea of how equal should we be. If we had a poll around this room, we would all have very different ideas of exactly how equal you should be and in what ways. How much is nature, how much is nurture, we'd all have ideas. But I find that even when I talk to Conservative audiences, which I do sometimes, that if you show people the trajectory that we're on, that from the early 80s, the trajectory of ever-growing inequality, that alarms almost everybody. Wherever you are on the political spectrum, you don't think, on the whole, maybe you do, but probably even you don't, that it's okay that we go on and on and on, accumulating vast wealth amongst fewer and fewer people at the top, while more and more people are in really low-paid jobs at the bottom, and even people with degrees and good qualifications who did everything they were supposed to do in very low-paid work and very little chance of moving up ladders. Most people think that's not right. Now, once you think that, you then have to start thinking, well, how do we stop it getting any worse? And actually, you have to do quite a lot of redistribution. You have to do quite a lot of things like tax credits. You have to do quite a lot of things like saying, maybe we need to pay a whole lot more for goods and services and pay people a lot more. And there are all kinds of mechanisms you can use. If you're a social democrat like me and not, an out-and-out Marxist, you don't have to have the perfect ultimate goal. You just have to say, in a Fabian kind of way, up with this I will not put, and we're going to make it better, as best we can, with the consent of as many people as you can, within the constraints of having to get elected, and for the majority to have to agree. The left will always push as hard as possible for things to be fairer. And I think to demand of them that they should say exactly how much in some notional utopian ideal world, if that's not where you're heading for.
Yes, that's all very reasonable, but it's not quite what I'm saying. We know that there is massive inequality in Western societies, and not just in Western societies, throughout the modern world, and the world in which we're living, where there's constantly new means of transmitting property and accumulating property through new devices on the internet and so on. Nobody does know quite how to control this. But my thought was that isn't the only value. There are other things that are important in political life. You yourself have just mentioned one of them, the consent of people to what you're doing. You're not a person who wants to impose equality on others, regardless of whether they can accept the procedure that you use. You're there. Your view as a social democrat is that we should be resolving such problems through the political process. And that was one of the issues in my book, that most of the thinkers I talk about have very little respect for the political process, recognize that revolution might be the way forward, and have no answer to the question, what do you do with those who don't agree with you? This has always been quite a serious problem for people on the left, because it always turns out in the end that people don't actually agree with what they're doing that much, and the question then arises, do we compel them or do we change course? And I think
why is that confined to the left? I mean, the notion of consent in the context of the cuts that Polly's referred to, very few of the victims or recipients of the round of cuts that will be coming in now have in any way meaningfully consented to.
No, that is absolutely true. And in the course of the political process, they will be able to register their protest, and presumably this will impact on the government at the next election. Well, we don't necessarily know that will be so. But this has been the case with all all kinds of plans that, the original Labour conception of what the position of the trade unions was in a modern society was finally rejected by the people. Polly will say, no, it wasn't. It was that evil Thatcher person that did it. But the fact is, she did it only because she won elections. And I'm all in favour of reconfiguring the debate between us as one, whether as to how the English electorate should be approached at the next election. But that's not what the thinkers that I write about in that book are concerned with at all.
But how relevant are they to the political situation today? I mean, this is because I'm fascinated to learn of the role that it played as a sort of underground publication in former Eastern Bloc countries, and that's of course why you were honoured by Václav Havel after communism fell in Czechoslovakia. But the relevance to a Jeremy Corbyn, David Cameron political battlefield is perhaps harder to identify.
It might be, but Corbyn's. Let's not get onto particular politicians. But we
will at some point.
Oh, will we?
Yeah.
Oh dear.
Well, let me move instead to cuts, because I think it would be fair to describe you as being generally quite fond of many institutions.
Yeah,
and institutions are being cut.
Yes, I take the view that the ultimate distinction between left and right is to be found there, that the left in the end thinks that the state must be involved in not just in redistributing property, but in the management and sustenance of institutions. I think that, on the contrary, civil society is where institutions should be founded and should begin, and the more of them that can liberate themselves from the state, the better. I think that is true of education and of all kinds of places in our society where people just assume that it's the state's responsibility to do something. Of course, sometimes the state has that responsibility, but by taking that responsibility, it tends to kill the instinct in people to combine and create institutions for themselves. And I think we've seen that all over Europe in the 20th century. And although Polly thinks it's terrible that we might have only 35% of the national income passing through the state, when you see what happens and you've got 60% of it, as in France, I think you begin to worry about the institutional health of the country. So I'm perfectly happy to think that institutions do have an obligation to maintain themselves in being, just as much as...
You said it for education. I mean, how you mean the state wouldn't pay for it at all?
No, the state can pay... this is I'm a grammar school boy, of course, so I had the benefit of a state education. But my school was nevertheless totally independent in its curriculum, its method of teaching. I want to get as much independence as possible for institutions like that. And I'm in favour of a voucher system whereby parents can themselves be supported by the state in order to themselves support independent institutions.
I mean, the curious thing is that where we are at the moment, though, the radical, revolutionary turmoil is coming from the right, not the left. Labour Party's in a rather peculiar position of finding itself being the conservators of institutions, and good ones. Great national treasures like the National Health, the BBC, under huge attack from this government, who viscerally dislike them, resent them, recognise that they're really very popular, they're quite tricky to touch, but within days almost of the general election, swiping 700 million out of the BBC out of sheer spite. The NHS
had a
has
good time
had...
from the BBC. I wouldn't feel quite the same positive response as you do towards it.
Well, I don't think you've got a television, have you? You don't watch television?
No.
No. So you are one of a tiny proportion of people who don't participate in any of that. So it's probably hard for you to understand how incredibly valuable it is to people who do. Do you listen to the radio?
Yeah.
Oh, you do? Right. You listen to the BBC? No, you only listen to commercial.
No, of course I listen to BBC Radio 3.
You do? Well, is it valuable and precious?
Yeah, but it gets hardly any of the budget. You know, I would love I'd be totally in favour of the BBC if the whole budget went to Radio 3.
Well, we'd all have our own bits to pick and mix, and the BBC has to keep all the balance of everybody's interests. But I do find it interesting that the rippers down, the diggers up, the tearing up at the roots, the radicalism is from Osborne and Cameron. They want, everything.
But, Polly, if I may interrupt,
the state does to be stopped.
You're locked in the present moment. You can only think of Osborne and Cameron and people like that. In my book, I'm thinking of Sartre and Foucault, people who entered our culture, the culture of Europe in the 50s and 60s, changed the language. That we wouldn't have the concept of the bourgeoisie that has influenced French and German politics through and through if it weren't for them. We wouldn't have that conception of what it's all about.
Mrs. Merkel's Germany.
Well, look, exactly. But again, you see, you want to put it into the present tense. Real knowledge is about the past tense, the things that are in your mind without you being conscious of them. And that's what I'm really writing about.
Indeed.
I understand
Polly,
that.
let me just encourage you to speak in the past tense for a while. The thinkers who you believe do drive left-wing ideology today, you reject the notion that Roger's targets in the book have had that much influence on the roster of PMs that you mentioned. Who would you put on the list?
I doubt that very many people in Labour MPs have read any of those much. I would think very few of them, or very few in Blair or Brown's government either. I don't think it's very much. Maybe some of the people around Corbyn, the much older people around Corbyn, a bit. But again, not all. I think you are right that you have a critique of the whole Marxist view of history. I think you're right about the profound influence that has had on all of our thinking. And this government is trying very hard to root that out. The sense that historical forces, that power and money influence the way we all live our lives, that we are not individuals with our destiny in our hands, where we're born, where we come from, what our origins, how much power and money we have, our parents have, enormously influence our own destiny. And that is a sort of Marxist thought. What's so depressing is that is really disappearing, and you're finding a far more American way of thinking about society, which really rejects that and says, it's up to every individual. We're all rugged individuals out there on our own. You can make it if you can, from log cabin to White House. And you talk to really quite poor people in this country, let alone in America, and they internalize it, they blame themselves. They say, I just never tried very hard at school. I guess I could have done. Some people did and did better, and I should have tried harder. It's my fault that I am where I am, cleaning, catering, caring, with no political architecture, the way that when people belonged to unions much more, they had a sort of political education that you would call indoctrination, that would say, you know what, it's not just you. There are forces out there that have influenced your destiny enormously. All right, there's a measure of free will, a measure of talent, endeavour, and all of those things, but also there is this incredible power that holds you down very often.
And the power is deliberately
those of
applied.
us who are born in a privileged position, keeps us up.
So that power, Roger Scruton, if your objection to all of your targets in the book is essentially that they want to do too much, is the opposite of that doing nothing?
I think that's partly one of my objections, but the thing that most interested me about the thinkers who were so influential in the 1960s and 70s was, of course, that they were obsessed with power and wanted to transfer power from this fiction that they called the bourgeoisie to this other fiction they called the proletariat, but also that they were intent on destroying the language of open debate. So much of it is a rejection of the basic structures through which we argue our position. And this is why I've taken on board people who probably are not familiar to politicians in this country, people like Lacan, Deleuze, Guattari, a whole collection of frauds who came out of the 60s and dominate our universities. And this is relevant to what Polly is saying, because a young American going to an Ivy League university for which his parents might pay $50,000 a year, and reading a humanities degree in political science, philosophy, or English, whatever, will be subjected to a curriculum created by those people. He'd have to read this total, incomprehensible jargon for 3 years, come away with the sense that really the life of the mind is worthless, so I might as well be doing business. And that's why people turn in the direction that you're rightly lamenting, that they can't acquire culture at universities anymore. They have to go into the rat race completely unprepared.
I don't think I'm rubbish universities to that degree, but I'd quite like to take up something else you're saying. One of your themes, really, is the sort of cultural calamity of the 50s and 60s, and liberal in its small L broadest form, the damage that it's done to culture in general. And I would put it absolutely the other way around. I would say there was such a flowering of progressive thought, of gay rights, of human rights, of sex and race discrimination acts, all the way through, of freedom of people for whether it was for abortion and contraception, freedom of people to do what they want without constraint, so long as it didn't damage anybody else. And you've set yourself up as regarding all of that as part of the fallout from these sorts of thinkers.
Absolutely not, actually. I think that the freedoms that you've just mentioned, some of them are good and some of them not so good. But they only occurred in countries where the government was still open to debate about what one should do. Where the Marxists and their clones had triumphed in Eastern Europe, those freedoms that you mentioned didn't exist. So I think and it's always been, this is one of the complaints that I have against Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson and all those people, and the New Left Review and Perry Anderson and so on, is that they never took seriously the fact that the ideas that they were defending, when installed in power, abolished the freedom of ordinary people to disagree with them, or to live in another way. And I think one should take that seriously. One shouldn't. We take the Holocaust seriously. We've got to take the Gulag as seriously as well.
Absolutely, I totally take that point. And I think you had to make distinctions between some of those people. Some of them were apologists for that. Some of them were not. Some of them continued to think that a fairly extreme left ideology could work with freedom, despite the fact that it hadn't actually panned out that way in existing communist societies. But I would take you up, and I think what you were doing in Czechoslovakia was terrific. It was very good. The whole of the sort of samizdat movement of spreading new thoughts and ideas. But it did in its own way lead to a kind of calamity too, because when the wall came down, what happened was people who had lived in such an extreme socialist society, very much encouraged by you, by the Americans and others, flipped the other way to such an extreme. They went for total market in a way that absolutely destroyed their economies, that allowed oligarchs to take over large chunks of their industry absolutely unchecked, because they bought a free market, a nonsensical, total free market ideology, which may not have been yours, but it was the net effect of the right moving in on those countries and them thinking that represents freedom, as opposed to a reasonably tolerant social democratic middle way.
Well, I beg to differ with your interpretation of the history. I think the oligarchs were already there, poised. They were the senior members of the Communist Party, and they were ready to do it. And it wasn't my doing, I promise you. Everything that I had said to anybody in that part of the world was about exactly what we've been talking about: the need for institutions, the need for social cooperation, the need not to go straight into a free-for-all, but to maintain in being those structures of social life which are really important to people, like the family and the school and so on.
Well, that's interesting, because if there has been a paradigm shift between the two editions of the book, it would, and the thinkers you address are chiefly motivated by class, whether it is your fictional bourgeoisie versus your fictional proletariat or something more nuanced than that. Today, the left seems perhaps to define itself more on issues of gender, race, sexuality, which are largely unaddressed by either you or your targets.
Not entirely. I think Foucault changed the agenda around to race and to gender issues. This is difficult. You can't deal with all evils in one book, But
why would it be a leftist position to campaign, if you will, on gender, race and sexual issues? Is it just another manifestation of the egalitarian agenda?
It's a very difficult matter, this, because it's clear that as you rightly say, that the us versus them thing has shifted from class to other kinds of division.
Do you think it's the same armies, just a different battlefield?
I think my own view, which I don't express in the book, but which is my personal view, is that ultimately the leftist position is rooted in what Nietzsche called ressentiment, the resentment that others have what you haven't, and that the desire to take that away. This resentment can be felt in any area where people recognise human differences. And its first expression is the desire to equalise everybody, to take away any kind of distinction that people are laying claim to. And I think that has obviously affected our vision of the relation between the sexes and these much more complex gender issues that are now in the air.
Do you regret that? Do you wish that, women back in the home? You were very anti-gay at one point, and then you suddenly changed your mind.
I haven't ever changed my mind about anything.
The night is young.
Okay, this is an issue about which, as you know, it's almost impossible to speak openly and freely, because there is, you get accused of things, just as in the days when it was really necessary to discuss the race issue, talking openly about immigration got you classified as a racist.
It depends what you said.
No. Just discussing openly things that I said. I advocated integration of minorities rather than multiculturalism. And
let's stop there, because and this takes us back. I forget the name of the headmaster, Ray Honeyford.
Yeah.
And that when you were editing the Salisbury Review, a job which I think sort of rescued you from the penury that the attacks upon the original edition of this book may have inflicted upon you in a different universe. And you published this article by this headmaster from Yorkshire, whose pupil, it's incredibly prescient in a way, or at least predictive. 95% of his intake, I think, was Asian or Pakistani chiefly. And just remind us what happened, because I think that plays in very neatly to your notion of not being allowed to speak then about some things and not being allowed to speak now about others.
Yes. Well, he advocated integration, thinking that the school had the duty to deliver to these children a new kind of membership, not the membership of their community back home in Pakistan, not even the membership of their religion, although that was something that the family would necessarily look after, but membership of British society. And that meant understanding the curriculum, understanding the priority of secular law in our society. That takes precedence over the Sharia, and this is how we deal with things. Also, that girls are to be treated equally to boys and not to be hidden away. Children are not to be sent back in term time to their homes of their relatives in Pakistan, and so on. All kinds of things which I think most sensible people would agree about. But he was targeted immediately by the local Labour Party, I'm afraid, Polly, who said that this man is a racist, because just through saying that. And they got him out of his school, ruined his career, but also ruined my career too, because I was then targeted with this, and I was not able to speak publicly in universities for an awful long time after that.
What then? Because I don't know if this is a generational issue, and I mean no offence by that at all, but the notion of multiculturalism and integration being polar opposites.
Well, it is true that Ray Hungerford was persecuted in the name of multiculturalism.
Right.
And he was responding in the name of integration. Obviously, there are subtle ways where you could say that these could be combined in some, but that was how the dispute was represented. But anybody who defended his position was then called a racist, and that was the end of your career. So people were afraid to talk about this, and everybody knows this, they were afraid to talk during the 70s and 80s about what mass migration was doing to our country. Just to raise the question, just to put it in those terms, already put you in, made you into a target, and that you were a target for people on the left.
So much a matter of context that after you'd had Enoch Powell doing what he did with Rivers of Blood and all that, he laid down a line in which people were then going to fall one way or the other. It wasn't just the left that created that difficulty about discussing things. It came very much from the, pretty rough racist assaults from the right too.
It could be that there were people who said the wrong thing, and nobody, I don't want to defend what he said, although he didn't actually say what he said. But that's neither here nor there. The question is, when there are major issues facing the world, and where the left has planted its flag in the front line of there, the first thing that you find is that free speech is under threat. It was under threat then about race. It's been under threat about gender. My views about homosexuality are very complex. But if I said them now, with the Guardian audience about to have them on their iPods forever, I get the charge of homophobia. I don't care. I'm old enough now. I don't care about what people charge me with. But still, younger people can't say they're not free to disagree from the orthodoxy. The orthodoxy being that homosexual desire and heterosexual desire are just the same kind of thing, and that there is no grounds of any kind for distinguishing or discriminating between people on grounds of their orientation and so on. All these are perfectly sensible and defensible positions, but not everybody accepts them. And if you start disagreeing with them, you're in trouble. And you know that's true because you're a Guardian type yourself.
Me.
Yeah.
I started on the Daily Express, actually, but that's probably...
Well, there you are.
That's for another evening. So this notion then of being stifled, coming from a man who has effectively come here this evening to talk about a book which attacks others for exercising their freedoms and their beliefs.
Yeah. And no, but it's true that I've attacked them for what they freely expressed, but haven't ever tried to stop them saying it.
I find this competitive paranoia very odd for the reasons I started out with it. Where has the power really been in this country? It's been with the right. It's been with the right all along. Who's been in government most of the time? Who runs 85% of our newspapers that still, dwindling though the dead trees may be, set the agenda for news, for debate? Where is the big raucous sound coming from? I wish it was from The Guardian, but frankly, it's not. We can have competitive paranoias here, really, but I find yours very puzzling because there's no doubt that yours, you may be at the far end of it, or at a rather maverick end of it rather than far end of it, has been the overwhelmingly dominant voice.
Well, it's interesting you say that. It hasn't been in universities, the overwhelmingly dominant voice. In fact, in universities, it's been mine. And the woman who made the tea in our senior common room at Birkbeck, she agreed.
It's a shame she couldn't come tonight. She couldn't join us. She should step out from behind a curtain, perhaps. Let's just return to multiculturalism and also to the final chapter of the book, Roger, where you quote from Conrad, secret agent, don't you? The destruction of all that is. And the novel, of course, deals with a terrorist bomb in Victorian London. Do you, and I don't want you to be frightened to answer this, but do you think that perhaps the situation that we've seen in Paris recently does have can be traced back to the problems that you were describing in the 1970s and the 1980s?
Well, I think we were not allowed to discuss then this major issue, which is the compatibility or otherwise of the Sharia way of life with Western secular democracy, and whether there was a threat posed to our normal way of dealing with things by this, and if so, whether we should take any steps to integrate people who are coming from Muslim countries into our way of life through the schools and through whatever other procedures. It was really impossible to raise this question, and we know very well that the French Muslims contain large sections who have not integrated, in which it isn't just that people feel that they don't belong, but they feel that they have the right also to express their non-belonging in the way that we've just seen.
How do you force that issue then? What would need to be done now in your view to tackle?
Well, I don't know. You're putting it back into the present tense and into something very, very serious.
Well, let's go back into the past. Would you prefer Europe had, from the 1950s, put up a wall around it, let nobody else in, had a very strict system of, Europe for the Europeans, and had sort of barriers? Do you feel that we've gained nothing through opening doors, through being open to cultural influences, intellectual influences of all sorts from all over the place? Do you think we've had no benefit from that?
Of course I don't think that. I mean, there has been a benefit, many benefits, but there's also been a cost. And the fact is that the cost is now serious, and it might be more serious. And one of the things that would have prevented it being as serious as it is would have been a proper and open discussion, not policed by people who are wanting to call others racist all the time. And I think that the French have suffered from this as much as we have, and the whole world, of course, has to some extent suffered from this.
You say I'm pushing it into the present day, but in a sense, philosophy has always been as much about the present and the past. So what should the role of the public philosopher be in the context of current crises?
That's an interesting question, because whether there is such a thing as a public philosopher, I don't know. I'm a public intellectual, but when I sort of stand forth as a public intellectual, my colleagues will say, well, that's him being a public intellectual, not him being a philosopher. Okay. A real philosopher wouldn't do that. And they're right. And that's what's wrong with philosophy.
But on the other hand, when I bring things into the practical and say what matters about thinking is how much it does influence the real world, people's real lives, you're rather dismissive of that and say, no, we in our ivory tower universities is what really matters, the purity of thought for its own sake.
No, I think thought does matter. Getting things... Thought is the most wonderful gift that we have, and the pursuit of truth is a wonderful gift that we have. And one of the most important things that a university should represent is the free pursuit of truth wherever it might lead, without consideration as to what's going on in the world outside. And that is a huge benefit to people, even though they don't know why. And I think that is one reason why I'm so interested in these people that I write about.
Of course. And if you were to sort of identify things that you personally... Does it all come down to personal happiness then for you? Is it about the individual's emotional contentment rather than the sort of tidal waves of social change?
Well, it's about the culture,
Yes.
That has something to do with human happiness. We find happiness partly through the cultivation of our mental powers and so on, and at least I do. But that isn't the reason why it matters what the culture is saying and what emotions it's transmitting. The emotions transmitted through the culture come out in all kinds of other ways. And one way we've just seen in Paris, the culture that transmits that is something that we ought to be opposed to and trying to overcome with some rival account of what it is to live with your neighbours.
Where do you look to for that rival account?
That's a very good question. I would look to Christianity, but I recognise it doesn't have the kudos that it once had in our society. What we do have, however, is the kind of after image of Christianity in our common law jurisdiction and things, in our schools and in the old university curriculum before the French frauds took it over.
And many of the philosophers that you do admire were motivated by a deep dislike for Christianity. I mean, particularly the sort of 19th century continental philosophers, some of whom you've mentioned this evening, were trying to sort of build a moral framework that didn't need God. Well,
yes, I think that's what we would... I think most sensible middle-class people today, middle-class, I mean ordinary people today, would like to build up some kind of public philosophy that we all subscribe to, which didn't depend upon the belief in God, because we know that so many people don't have that belief, but which nevertheless enabled us to live at peace with each other without the desire to destroy rivals, and with the kind of institutional freedom that both Polly and I would defend. But, where that is to come from, I don't know. That is a major task of the intellectuals. It's what Sartre thought he was giving the French after the war. But it turned very quickly into a kind of tyrannical Marxism in his case.
The idea that living without God somehow casts us into the hands of extreme, socialism or extreme fascism or
nihilism.
Anything else, I think is absolutely not true. I'm a humanist. I'm a vice president of the Humanist Association, and I feel very strongly that we have within us an innate sense of right and wrong that is born in us, that the youngest child in the playground just has. We know it. We feel it. We have a sense of the greater good. We have a sense of what we do together collectively is far better than what we each do individually on our own. You could be reductionist and say, well, that's Darwinian. It's just it's the way we've evolved. I think it's more than that. I think there is something extraordinary about being human for exactly the reasons you say about the ability to think, knowledge of one's own death, all of these things. But the idea that somehow none of that really works except in a framework with a God seems to me something bizarre.
Well, that's
and God is
said.
Very often the problem.
Yeah,
but you were saying we were struggling to find, without a God, what this might be. It doesn't seem to me that the existence or non-existence of God is the issue.
No, but you belong to that class of self-assured guardian types for whom this isn't an issue. You've got to think of the other ordinary people who are lost and really...
Opium of the people.
Yeah, the people who have had a faith and lost it and want to find a way... it's fine to be a humanist and have all those ideas which I agree with, but if they can't be expressed in a way which gives consolation and certainty to ordinary people, they're of no great use to us.
Superstition for the masses, but
you're
rationality for the likes of us.
Trying to caricature everything I say. I'm raising a question which I think we all have, and how to find the answer to that question is one of the major problems for the life of any intellectual, I think.
Though what we're struggling with now is a nihilism that comes apparently out of some sort of religious belief. Though it's true, nihilism, as with the anarchists in Conrad that you quote, these nihilist movements can come out of all sorts of things, and terror comes out of all sorts of things, and we'll probably always live with small terrorist movements going on. We've all lived through, we've had it with the IRA, and to some extent, there was the Baader-Meinhof and the Minutemen. I mean, there are things spring up where people think episodes of extreme violence somehow will...
They're not necessarily small, these movements. There was the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution and the Chinese and the Vietnamese, etc.
And there's nothing small about the movements that we're seeing today. I'm keen to get stuck into the audience imminently, but before we do, just to refer back to the tragic events in Paris this weekend, I'll ask you both the same question. Polly, could you go first? Should the right and the left have different responses to the threat posed by Islamic State? Do the right and the left have different responses to this threat?
I'm not sure. I think probably the left, I think that the left impulse is far more to say we must do more to make sure that people don't feel excluded, left out, that the children, it's very often the children of new migrants, don't feel that they've somehow had no place for them. I think then you've got to look at the unemployment figures broadly, whether it's the particular people who become terrorists or not. You look at the unemployment figures for young black men or young men from foreign countries, foreign origin from their parents. It is far worse than the equivalent for people whose parents have lived here, families have lived here for generations. That's something you can fix. There are things that are fixable. I think that it often happens that, I wouldn't accuse you of this particularly, but that a conservative way of mind says discipline is the answer, crack down on them, be tougher, make them do this, that and the other, and that will somehow make them bend to our will, and very much the idea being it's them and us, and not in any way seeing that the more you think about them and us, the worse it will get. So I think there is a sort of instinctive difference of approach. But of course there are lots of Conservatives who don't think that way, and there are certainly some people on the Labour side who've traditionally been quite punitive in their response.
Indeed, but in terms of the broader churches of left and right, Roger, do you sort of, does what Polly says mostly chime with you?
It does, but I think one has to make distinctions between people. I don't think a Polish immigrant with a Christian background will present the same problem as an immigrant from rural Pakistan with a Muslim background. I think you've got to be realistic and recognise you're dealing with a different mindset, and there's a lot further to go.
That's an uncontroversial...
Well, if you mean... it's not controversial. I mean, some people are part of European life, and other people come from further afield and are going to find it harder. That's
Okay, there are microphones poised to start flying around the room. If you want to raise your hand in the air in time-honoured fashion, and we'll start taking some questions from the floor. I'll start in the front row with the gentleman here in white top.
Well, firstly, thank you very much to all three members of the panel. My name is Jordan Freud. I'm a student and also a freelance journalist. It seems to me that one issue that's come both out of this talk and from the Guardian Live Alternative Party Conference is that there's an issue with tribalism, that the looking at us versus them, which comes back obviously from ancient Greece, is something that we sort of want to get away from. And I think the Alternative Party Conference sort of wanted to have a coalition of views. How do you think we can have that in the public landscape? But I also wanted to say for Polly and Roger, don't know if you want to weigh in, James, it seems to me that the extremists who come from usually a Muslim background in this specific scenario, they don't actually want to be part of our society, although they would only want to be part of it if it was their view. So this idea of them being marginalised due to economic inequality, etc., I personally wouldn't think is the cause. It's a belief, which is why Cameron's calling it a poisonous narrative. Would you agree with that? And how do you think we can therefore try to look at it in a different aspect? Thank you very much.
So, Polly, if you can deal with the question about sort of alienation through choice.
Absolutely.
And then, Roger, if you could deal with the sort of accusation of a sort of hyper-intellectual form of nationalism or tribalism that you're
by the time somebody's been radicalised, of course, they are on another planet. They are almost impossible to reach. By the time they've decided that they will blow themselves up, and happy to see their little brothers blowing themselves up in the name of getting to a paradise somewhere as martyrs, by then it's all sort of far too late. But I think that probably does come out of a culture of feeling, never having felt, and whether, it may not be entirely the fault of, they may have been to schools that did their absolute best. It certainly comes out of a sense of cultural alienation, though. And I think it's very hard to deal with. I think it's very difficult. But, of course, it is a poisonous narrative by the time they've reached that state. it is an intellectual insanity.
Roger, the notion of tribalism, and possibly the inevitability, even the desirability of it, but also if I can expand on the question, you've written of your fondness for oikophilia, the Greek notion of fondness for community, and that, I don't know, is that not a concept that gets exploded by mass mobility, just the freedom to move?
Well, not every human problem is soluble. And it may be that this one isn't. My own view is that we can only live with the kind of benefits that we have. That's to say, democratic, secular government and a rule of law, and we all are familiar with them. We can only do that if we also have a shared first-person plural. We think that this is ours, and we are committed to it, and that we share it with the other.
Where are the parameters of ownership? This is the problem. We can do it in a village or a town or a city or a country or a continent.
We have developed since the 17th century the idea of the nation state in order to rationalise this. It isn't the only way of rationalising it, but of course in Islam the idea of the nation state is rejected. That isn't the way of rationalising this. On the contrary, it's the ummah, the totality of the faithful who are obedient to Allah.
Well, only to their own, each of them to their own particular bit. It's not as if they're a great unit. If they were, we'd have a lot less trouble. But as it is, they're very split between regions, nationalities, and different sects of Shia and Sunni.
But anyway, to continue, what I wanted to say is that indeed there is a kind of belonging, a first-person plural, which is essentially not tribal. It's attached. The national idea means attachment to a place, a country, which is ours, which has come down to us, and where we are.
You can't have a first-person plural without a third-person plural. If we have an us, there must be a them.
But you see, the European nations have, despite all their conflicts and wars, they have got used to the fact that they can live with them more or less humorously and tolerantly.
So gradations of themness.
Yeah, the themness, yeah.
Gentleman there, if you just there, yeah.
Let's start with the question. Could an aspirant politician in Britain who'd read Hobsbawm or E.P. Thompson or is it Michael Foucault, sorry, I'm not acquainted really with these people, or Habermas or Zizek, or any of the other people who take issue with Roger, could that person actually be elected in Britain? I really don't think they could. And isn't that the point? Isn't it the sheer lack of intellectual ambition in modern Britain, the really characteristic feature of our culture? Polly said, and this has been something that has been true for quite some time, since at least the 1980s, Polly claimed that Hayek was Margaret Thatcher's favourite reading matter, that she had a copy of Hayek's Road to Serfdom in her handbag. She may have owned a copy of it, but I don't think she ever read it. My understanding is that her favourite reading matter was Frederick Forsyth. Yeah. Tony Blair was asked once what music he listened to, and he came back with, I listened to what the kids listened to, which was Coldplay or something. Gordon Brown very famously claimed to be a fan of the Arctic Monkeys. I mean, in the 1970s, you did have intellectuals, or people we might have called intellectuals, involved in public life. One thinks of Keith Joseph on the right and Richard Crossland on the left. And that has all died off. I'm sorry, I'm taking a long time, but I'll try and wind up very quickly.
Go on.
Haven't intellectuals just failed us, just enormously? So the right and the left. The whole tradition of left thought has just died away and atrophied. It's just as dead as mutton. And on the right, think of the right, it's just ossified and turned into a kind of senile mid-19th century classical liberalism. In Britain has conducted a vast experiment replacing...
I think we've understood your question, even if you haven't quite got there yourself yet. The point is, of course, one that we've touched on already several times this evening, whether or not there is any interplay, because you've objected yourself, Roger, to the dragging everything into the present day, into the political and away from the philosophical. Is there a relationship between the life of the mind, between the philosophical, and between the real politic of the 21st century?
I think it is a very important issue. If we look back to the 19th century, Disraeli and Gladstone competed for power. There was a major novelist and a major Dante scholar competing to be prime minister. That is quite remarkable. Now we don't have quite that kind of perspective on things. However,
not quite.
I have to say that there have been some interesting examples to the contrary. The last important one being Václav Havel. How often do you get presidents who are major playwrights? And he was in a tradition. The first president, Masaryk, was a fairly important philosopher. And, so I think the Czechs seem to have done better than us in this. And I suspect that most French politicians do have a copy of Les Fleurs du Mal in their pocket.
And yet the English, the British, maybe the...
I think the British have always had a sort of anti-intellectual tradition, really, and it's quite difficult to be a politician who admits to having sort of intellectual interests. I'm not sure that really philosophy and serious intellectualism works very well with politics. Politics is about the here and now, the practical, the everyday. Plato didn't do so well in Syracuse. It's kind of always been a problem that putting the two together doesn't... I mean, I respect politics enormously. I think it's a great art and a very difficult one that involves all sorts of strands of, the great practitioners of it. Very difficult indeed. But I think probably the purity of philosophical thought is not a strand that's very common in British politics.
Well, that's probably indisputable, but very briefly, because I asked you this earlier and you didn't answer it, who are the thinkers that influence the Labour movement today? Are there any?
I think they're mostly sort of American. I think, it's people like Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam, new thinkers, Michael Sandel, people like that. I think that the Labour Party, anyway, has tended to look to American sort of liberal thinkers about communitarianism and ideas of that kind.
Okay. Have we got a microphone? There's lots of hands in the air upstairs. Can we come to this gentleman here? I don't know if you can tell where I'm pointing. The one with his hand most violently raised.
Thank you. I just thought I'd better, in response to the previous questioner, speak up as a Tory parliamentary candidate at the election who has read a little bit of Hobsbawm, Foucault, Rousseau, and even some Bernard Mandeville from time to time.
Under duress at university or voluntarily?
Oh, no, voluntarily. I can't say I agree with them all. But I just wanted to... The question was posed towards the start of the evening about what united a lot of Roger's left-wing opponents beyond just his hostility to them. And I wondered if both of you could speak to what you think stands behind a certain rather troubling strand within left-wing philosophy that unites a whole load of seemingly totally incompatible ideologies, such that communists, anarchists, Islamists, eco-warriors can march together down Piccadilly, united by nothing more, it seems, than a belief that my enemy's enemy is my friend, their enemy being their perception of the British establishment as they see it, and that has, without trying to sound too tribal, it appears now in the embodiment of Polly's former Guardian colleague Seamus Milne, captured the very heights of the Labour Party.
I may need to...
What unites
this strand of
what unites them?
That unites these people who have... What does a communist philosophically have in common with an anarchist? What does an anarchist have in common with an Islamist? And yet
there are really practically no anarchists. They make a lot of noise. They have class war, the great big banners up, and they make a lot of noise and have bright-coloured hair and shout a lot, but there are only a handful of them, really, and they're not exactly a serious force in British politics. The communists are virtually non-existent. What happens when you have a big demonstration against, cuts, against whether it's going to be against tax credits, against cuts in the health service or whatever it might be, are people united by their view about what's going on that particular policy. And that seems to be very reasonable, that people from all sorts of strands of opinion, whether they're SNP, Green, Labour, Tusk or whatever, should march together. What's wrong with that? You might well get people on the right, in favour of fox hunting, countryside issues, who would come from all sorts of strands, and maybe not even all of them from the right, about a particular issue.
So, Roger, what does unite all of your targets?
Well, I sympathise with this question because it is pointing to something that I think lies deep in the left-wing mentality, which is what Engels called the labour of the negative. That we're looking to define ourselves in terms of what we're against. And being against power, authority, the things, the powers that be, is a tremendously important motive. And it's much more important to find alliances with those who are also against it than actually to define why you are against it or what your alternative to it is.
That's what everybody always says about everybody else. I could produce for you a narrative about why the left is by far the most positive. We think things can change for the better.
I know you do. Yes, because you're much more self-opinionated than I am.
Time for a microphone, I think. Can we come down here?
I've got one here. I just wanted to go back to Roger his voice being shut down back in the 70s and the 80s, and to ask whether Polly and Roger recognise the voices that are being shut down nowadays by a certain tone coming from the left. And that tone is that if you don't agree with us, you are somehow wrong and evil.
What issues in particular are you...
For example, when Polly was talking about cuts, she said they're just sheer spite. Yeah. Now, you did say that, Polly. You said it's just for sheer spite. There are obviously arguments for and against, but as someone coming from the right, I find this I'm just a mother and have a fairly unimportant full-time job. But I find that I can't speak to people about what I think because I'm shut down because I'm from the right, and therefore the immediate assumption is that my motives must be evil in some way. My motives for cuts must be because I want other people to be poorer, not because I think that actually there's another way of achieving exactly the same things that Polly wants. But because of the language of the left, I am continually shut down. I work full-time. Continually I hear about how there must be 50% women in the boardroom. I know many sorts of women who have fairly menial jobs, who had absolutely fantastic jobs in the city. Most of the women that I know, they don't want to do that. If they can afford it, they stay at home and look after their children because 30 million years of evolution have been telling them to do that. But I can't say that. I can't say that.
You see, you can't say it.
I can't say that. Those are the people that I know, but the only people I hear are people like Polly saying...
Just if you could just put the question into one sentence.
Do you recognise that there are people nowadays on the right who are simply being shut down because they are being labelled as evil for having...
I think there is always a tendency to try and shut down the person of the opposite point of view. But the idea that you're a beleaguered minority when there is the Daily Mail day after day after day talking to women like you about women like you...
Roger...
The Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, read them. You will be very at home with them. And they are a much bigger voice than us in The Guardian. You may just have the wrong friends. You may have Guardian reading friends. Make more friends with Telegraph readers.
Roger Scruton, where is the tension then, or the clash between the right to be heard and the right of the person listening to find you wrong or repellent?
I think this is a very important point. Well, of course, we all have the right to be offended by things that people say, and if the climate of opinion is such that the young lady over there is going to get this kind of groaning, contemptuous noise that we heard, then of course she's going to be intimidated. I'm not intimidated, although this groaning, contemptuous noise has accompanied me for 70 years. It's just a matter of inuring yourself to it.
You should read the threads under my column.
No, you never do that, ever. It's a brilliant point, but is there not a danger on the left and the right of people actually claiming that their freedoms are being impinged when what they really mean, and this probably ties back to your immigration observations, not all of them, but the notion that you want to be free to say without being challenged. And if you say you're calling me a racist, that's quite a neat way of saying, how dare you challenge me?
There are certain ways of challenging somebody's opinion which are calculated to shut him up. Namely, by applying to him a label which you know will lead to damaging effects on his career. And that is certainly true in the teaching profession and the universities with the label racist. You couldn't...
Is it better now than it was in 1985?
No, because it's just different labels. Look at poor old Jermaine Greer the other day. It'll change every day, the label, because this does come, as was made clear by the young man at the back just then, this comes from that negativity, that desire to define the world in terms of what I'm against.
I do agree with you about no platforming, and I think it happens partly because students have very little agency except within universities. So if they want to make a great stand in favour or against something, all they've got is the very limited world of who is or isn't going to speak and say what in their university, which is a pity because actually they should be operating, if they feel strongly about things, in the world outside. But I'm very against no platforming. I think you should hear all the arguments, even obnoxious ones, and argue them into the ground, not shout them into the ground. Absolutely.
I make that at least 2.5 areas of complete agreement between the two. Can we have the hands in the air again, please? I'm sorry, I genuinely don't have my glasses on. The white-haired human being there, please.
Sadly.
Okay.
To take up almost the last point that Polly made, and to switch to something rather maybe narrowly political, everybody, or certainly the Conservative government, has argued we must defeat this appalling ideology of ISIS and whatever. On the other hand, I'm a regular Guardian reader, I keep half abreast of ideas. I don't know what it is. I think I need to go on the web and find out. I feel if you're going to defeat an ideology, the only way to do it is to have people representing these views on television, in the newspapers, their views being properly represented in schools. And therefore I feel talk about defeating an ideology means allowing people to come out and express those ideas and taking them on. Do you agree about that? And if you do you think, well, we need to do that? It has not been done now. The exact opposite is being done. There has been an attempt through the de-radicalisation programme to almost say anyone that gets close to expressing this ideology their job will be in danger or whatever. We need to allow them out there. Do you or don't you agree with this?
Roger?
Yes. But if it's out there, it's got to be really out there. And we must encourage people to not just to criticise, but to laugh at it, to mock, to make these people look as ludicrous as they are, to undermine their ability in that way to pose as extraordinary heroes.
Just pause there, because I want you to refer back to the previous question then about your disapproval of people being shouted down and laughed at and called names, because you seem to be saying that it's all right for some people to be treated like that.
No, being shouted down and called names is
or the groaning, the booing.
No, you have to confront this. As I say, everybody has a right to disapprove of what has been said and to be offended by it, and these people, the IS people, have that right too to be offended. But if we really want to confront what they're saying, we have to assume our right, not just to criticise it, but to say exactly what we think about it. And what we think might be that it is a totally ridiculous and humiliating thing to believe.
Polly?
I've always felt that there has been a tendency to sort of flatten all views in public discourse, fear of the extreme. I mean, take Thought for the Day. I mean, is that a representative of religion? I would like to have heard Ian Paisley ranting on Thought for Today. I would like to hear extreme Muslim clerics giving it their full welly. I would like people to hear religion at its hot, not at its kind of smoothed out BBC, it's all C of E really with different hats on. I detest religions, and I wish them to appear in their full, florid, psychotic forms, wherever possible, in public.
Three and a half. More hands in the air, please.
Mine is a very simple and short question. Going back to the very beginning, we were talking about consent, and we were talking about the key difference between left and right being a belief in the right being rolling back the state, handing as much as possible to the private sector and so on, and the position of the left being the reverse. I was born in 1955. Can either of the speakers tell me of an occasion in my lifetime when the majority of people voting in an election have supported a party that openly advocated that right-wing view? When the majority of voters, not the majority of seats, but the majority of voters have supported that sort of red-in-claw conservatism. I can't think of a single one. After all, at the last election, it was only 37%.
It's a rhetorical question, right?
No, I'm asking...
No, that's all right.
Carry on. Let's hear the answers. We're very short of time.
What I'm saying, therefore, there is no consent, is there? When a government only has vastly less than half of the votes cast and even less of the electorate supporting them, they do not have the consent of the people. Is it not extraordinary that the House of Lords better represents the views of the electorate than the House of Commons?
That's going a bit far. I'll tell you when we happen to agree with them just at the moment. I do think we have a monstrous electoral system. Of course people can't express what they really feel through our electoral system. Of course there should be a Socialist Party, a Social Democratic Party, a John Redwood Party and a Ken Clarke Party. Of course there should be an ability to identify more closely what it is you're voting for. As it is, people know it's going to be a Labour Prime Minister or a Tory Prime Minister. They look at the two, they hold their nose and vote for the least awful. And that's the only option they've got. And I spend my time before elections saying, I'm sorry, but you've just got to do it. You may hate that Labour candidate, whoever it is, but basically, if it's not them, it's the Tories, and there's no other way of expressing it. But we had an AV referendum, and I would say mostly through an absolutely abominable campaign run by the press of total misrepresentation. People voted against having even a little bit more choice in who to vote for. A first preference, and then still a backstop vote to stop their their most worst alternative. And I fear we're not going to have another referendum on this for a while because Nick Clegg made such a pig's ear of it.
Roger, politics by consent, even when it is...
I disagree with the sentiment behind the question, because I don't think that an electoral system should simply be asking people to decide an issue in terms of their opinions about things. I think they should be thinking of their interests. And we had a very useful distinction in our system between the representation of the constituents and the opinions of the member. I think every member of Parliament has a primary obligation to represent his constituents, regardless of their opinions. He's there in Parliament to represent them. He might be someone like Frank Fields, with whom I agree about most issues, but is in the Labour Party with whom I agree about little. But, he is a perfect constituency MP. And that idea of representative democracy is a much healthier one than the kind of idea that I think Polly is putting forward, where you have hundreds of people clamouring for attention just because of the things they happen to think, even though they haven't got a brain to think.
And is this determined by the... I think you've just answered the question I was about to ask. This is determined by the calibre of candidate rather than the quality of the electoral system.
And his ability to have a publicly spirited relation with his constituents.
I think these days MPs do have quite a close relationship with their constituents, work far harder there every weekend in a way that they really weren't 30 years ago.
I think it's getting better.
Yeah. And they're held in a lower regard, arguably, than ever before.
Well, they've always been held in rock-bottom regard, really. Ipsos Mori has the Ben page comes out. There was a Gallup poll in the middle of the war, I think it was in about 1942, asking people, do you think politicians act primarily for the good of the country, for the good of their party, or for the good of themselves? And they came out absolutely rock bottom in the middle of the war as for themselves and their party, not the country. So I think it's... and if you look at graffiti in ancient Rome, people adore democracy and they hate the practitioners of it.
Plus ça change. One more question I have time for.
I'm from Brazil and I'm studying here at Queen Mary University, and I'm right when I say something during the class about my thoughts. It's a little war of 40 against 1, so I have no right of thought there. But my question is another one. I want to ask you if hundreds millions of deaths under socialist countries in history, it's a part of the plan or just a little accident in the middle of the way leading us straight ahead to the perfect society.
I thought we'd end on a light one. Back to the gulags, Roger Scruton.
Well, I sympathise entirely with the questioner that although all left-wing people say that it's a pure deviation from what we believe, the gulag and the Chinese Cultural Revolution, etc., I'm not convinced. I think that it is actually the realisation of the kind of equalising order that socialists have always wanted. But, Polly, of course, won't agree. She will say that it's...
Let's find out. Polly, last word.
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think there are very, very few extreme socialists around anywhere in politics in Britain at the moment. And I don't think there are, perhaps a few apologies. You get a faint sort of backwash of a slight sense in some places of... apologetics for Putin, as if it were a kind of shadow of an old memory of apologetics for the Soviet Union, which I find bizarre. But really, if you talk to most Labour MPs, all Labour MPs just about, they are, well, even he...
You didn't want to do the present day, Roger Scruton.
You didn't want to do present day. All right, I don't agree with his foreign policies in lots of different ways, but if you look at his domestic policies, that he's not wanting to send the intelligentsia back to the fields in a Maoist way. He doesn't want to, there is no great plan that says we will sacrifice all of these people now for the greater purity of our cause in the future. These are all social democrats. They are gradualists and would amongst themselves have different ideas about how far you can go. But we are so far from anything that could remotely be called dangerous socialism that just to ask for a little bit more equality, at least to ask for it not to get worse, does not lead to the gulag.
And that's a rousing point at which to call a halt to this evening's proceedings. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking our panellists, Roger Scruton and Polly Toynbee. Thank you very much.
For more great downloads, go to theguardian.com/audio.